Hello again. Um, this video would be a deep dive into the inner workings of fast-gov-uk. And we'd be looking at how pages and forms and such things um, work under the hood. Um, let's get started. Here we go. I'm using VS Code now because I love Vim. Um, yeah, but it like I wanted to use a visual debugger because I felt like it would be the best thing for showing like the internals of the framework. So here we are, right? I love Vim, but I'm not an ideologue. This should be fine. Okay, let's get started. So first thing I do is I run the same application that we built. So to hope you, if you saw the last video, you would recognize this code. If you didn't see the last video, um, here is here is like a basic sort of starter template for fast-gov-uk that I copied from over here. And then what we did was we kind of we built our own feedback form, right? And here is the feedback form. Watch the last video. I talk about all of this code, right? So this would be about more um, like a promise, like we're going to put a lot of debuggers deep into the guts of FastGIF UK, and we are going to poke around and see how it does what it does, how are things put together. I think that would be a useful, it will be a useful exercise. So first things first, let's run this. I bet you could run it like this, Python file. Uh, Let me get rid of this. And it seems to be running, same URL. I think it works. Yeah, it seems to be working just fine. What I'm interested in is let's first look at the page stuff, right? So close this. So if I want to look at the page stuff, I can kind of command click this decorator. Like this is the first sort of Lego block. So this is a decorator, and what it does is it basically so fast.gov.uk is kind of um, built upon something called fast-HTML. So fast-HTML is a very popular new sort of framework that allows you to build um, modern web services in pure Python, right? And that's we're using this under the hood to build fast.gov.uk. This is really cool, by the way. So I'd encourage you to kind of read up on this. But anyway, back to our code. So fast-HTML has this route decorator that we're using to kind of like when you declare a page like so, underneath, under the hood, we're using the route decorator that comes out of the box with fast-HTML to kind of hook it to the URL that you specified. If you don't specify a URL, we kind of use the function name as the URL, right? So that's fairly simple, I guess. So that's not like and yeah, like once we do that, like you kind of hit the URL and you see the page. So there's not a lot we are doing in terms of fast.page is a very thin wrapper around the route decorator in the underlying fast HTML framework is what I'm trying to say here, right? So there's nothing like I'm doing here that is magic. The other piece here is the page object, right? So if I go to the page, so this is in design system pages module. And what this does is like it's a function and it basically you kind of pass in arbitrary content to this function. You can also pass in um, some navigation, which like if you want a nav bar, for example, right? Like you can pass it in and it would display it. You can also pass in a sidebar. All of that works. It's fine. But let's look at the code though. So what happens in the code is like it is kind of like does a bunch of stuff that that kind of displays that gov.uk style page with gov.uk styling and all of that. And the way the thing that I want you to look at is this bit here, for example. So this is where it's loading the scripts. Um, this has a fairly one-to-one correspondence with the HTML that like gets generated, right? So it does that. One and oh, sorry, another thing that I would like you to note is this bit, right? So what this does is instead of like so imagine like the cookie banner, right? Like so we do have a cookie banner by the way in fast-gov-uk. I forgot to show it in the last one. The reason is that well, I didn't do this. So if I go here and I do this and I kind of delete the cookies and then I refresh. So when you're opening this service for the first time, you get this very basic cookie message, right? And what we could have done is we could have kind of baked it into the page, but instead what we are doing is we're kind of like using HTMX, which is another really cool piece of technology that fast HTML uses to load what I would call partial HTML from server side and insert them into the sort of DOM. So what this is saying is that there's a div, and that div would be populated by a GET request on this URL, cookie banner, right? And the trigger for that GET request is when the page loads, right? So let's look at the cookie banner um, endpoint and see what it does. What it does. So I'm in the wrong place. It should be over here somewhere. Cookie banner. Mm, yeah, there it goes. So this is like a regular sort of fast HTML endpoint that takes in a request. It also takes in a post sort of dictionary. So it's a form, right? And what it does is like if it's a GET request, it just returns a cookie banner, which is like one of the components in the design system. It's fairly um, easy to do that. But if it's a post request, what it does is it kind of sets a session saying that you accepted the cookie policy, and it sets the age of the session to be 1 year, which is like the standard recommended sort of I accepted the cookie policy session age. And yeah, so another thing that I'd like you to note here in the page thing is that the space banner. Now we could have composed the page object to sort of include the face banner within it, but then it would be hard to modify it, right? Like where would you you'd have to write your own page and like modify the face banner, and that's a bit of a faff. So the way we did it was that we used HTMX for browser side composition, right? So imagine if face banner was coming from a entirely different sort of endpoint, which it is. So that endpoint is somewhere over here. Let me see if I can find it. Here is the phase sort of function, right? So what it does, it returns a phase banner, and it kind of gets hooked up to the slash phase URL within the framework. But if you want to override just the phase banner, you can declare your own uh, at fast.page phase and write whatever function you need to write. And what that would do is that would override the endpoint mapping from the default to whatever you defined. And so whenever a page loads anywhere in the rest of your service, it would still hit the phase endpoint, but the thing it gets back would be defined by you. And that's how you override a phase banner. And the same idea is for the footer, right? So the footer is like being rendered at this URL, and there is a default implementation of a footer that comes out of the box with the framework. But if you want to change it, just declare a page that renders at this URL and make it return whatever footer you would like for your service. And that's how you override little bits in the page object. So yeah, I mean, that's like, I think that's a lot to digest. I'm sorry. That's a lot to digest about this page bit. But like the big picture stuff is that it's a standard gov.uk page. It kind of comes out of the box with like a bunch of things that you'd expect to see in a gov.uk page so that you don't have to. And it's a nice, convenient sort of function to reach out to when you want to return a page, right? And not have to customize everything. Um, that's nice. So that's how this works. But that's not the most interesting bit. So let's see if like, yeah, service is running. So I want to talk about the forms thing, right? Because that's a bit more interesting, right? So the form decorator, um, it does a couple of things, right? So I mean, it does one thing, I think. So what it does is there is a form dictionary inside this sort of fast app object. Let me find it. It's here, right? And what the form decorator does is it registers the function on which you apply the decorator as um, as a form. Um, and when I say register, it basically adds it to the dictionary, right? So the key being the URL and the value being the function, right? And the second thing it does, right? There is there is an endpoint here called process form. Now let's start messing around here, right? So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and what I'm going to then do is I'm going to hit refresh on my page here, right? So on the, not hit refresh. I'm going to go to the feedback form page, and here we go, right? So we kind of hit that breakpoint, and what this is doing is like um, the first thing it does is it tries to get the form, right? So because you're hitting the endpoint slash forms slash feedback, it recognizes that slash forms means it hooks up to this function, and slash feedback is kind of injected into this function as this as this keyword argument, right? Name, right? So the name here is feedback. Request is your request, right? It's a standard endpoint, right? So it gets a request and it returns a response. And post is a dictionary. When you fill up a form and submit it, it would contain the data, right? So we get to this. So the first thing it tries to do is tries to get it tries to query the forms dictionary and see if there is something called feedback here. Because if there isn't, it should return a 404, right? So we can actually try this. So if I do this and keep this, if I let it run from here and I go back and I change the URL, right? Like to a form that doesn't exist. So it comes back here and I keep it running. It gets you a 404, right? Because it couldn't find a form called feedback one, but it should find a form called feedback. So back. So let's see. So if it finds up, I'm going to step through this. It finds a form just fine. Because I'm getting the form for the first time, this is a GET request, right? Like, which is like where you render the empty form. And so if this is a GET request, now, by the way, I don't know if you noted, but when it was querying the forms dictionary, it kind of stored the value in something called MIC_form, which is like, I don't think it's a good name, but what it says is that here is the function that would make the form, right? Like it's the form constructor. And this is the same function. And this is the function, right? It's a feedback function. So the framework has registered this function as a thing that I can call to make this particular form, right? That's how it works. And so because the request is a GET request, right? Like you can see this. And so it would step inside and it would basically call this function without any arguments because we don't have any data right now. And what that would do is it would render an empty form, right? Now let's try and fill this form and then run through the thing again and see what like the code path, right? So do this again. We are back, same function. This is like the kind of the state machine that does the form things, right? So let's step through this, right? So is there a form called feedback? Yes, there is. Is this request a GET request? No. At this moment in time, it's actually a post request. Now, if it's a post request, the data that the user filled up should be available in the post dictionary, and it is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the form, but I'm going to pass the post dictionary into the form so that it can be received here and then hooked up to this form object that we are going to look at next, so that when the form is instantiated, it is like bounded to the data. The data is bounded to the form. Either way. Um, but initiate the form, but with the data this time, because we have the data. And so that's fine. It did that. Now, the next question is that there are two possible code paths from here, right? Now, if the form is valid, you call the backends, right? So our form has backends, a log backend, a DB backend. And so over here, if the form is valid, and I think it is, it would basically call something, call a method called process on the form object. And we will get to this in a bit. If it's not valid, it just returns the form. And just because we initiated the form with the post dictionary, just by binding that data to the form object, it kind of populates the data, like it populates the data into the right input fields. But in doing so, it also populates the error. Like if the data is not valid, it populates those inputs with the right errors. And we'll see this in a bit. But in this case, right now, the form is valid. So this will get processed, right? Like, and it will call the process method. And it's probably a good time to go and see this. Let's see. Clicky. I can do this, right? I should have been able to do this. Anyway, I just command click this thing. So this is the form object, and I'm looking for the process method right now, just to kind of, so that the code part that we are going through makes sense, and then we'll come back and we'll do the other things, right? So this is the process method. It's very simple. You remember form has a list called backends. So the process method, all it does is it kind of goes through those backends in order, and then it calls the process methods for those individual backends, right? And it kind of passes in some utility arguments when it calls the process method, and it is a unified API, but a lot of the time these arguments are used to do useful things by the backend, right? So in this case, right, like so it does that. If there's a backend error, it raises it. Otherwise, it returns the success URL, like it redirects to the success URL, right? So that's the story here. But now that we are, like, it might be fun to kind of look at some of the backends, right? So I'll put cheeky little breakpoints in a process method, right? So this one is for, like, this is the generic backend. It's fine. This is the log backend. And we can kind of put a cheeky little, or we do have a log backend. So we put a breakpoint here and then we press play, and it stopped again at the log backend, right? So this is, it stopped here. And the name is feedback, so all the data is coming through, and the log backend, what it does is logger.info, right? There's nothing clever happening here. And so, yeah, we can keep going. And that kind of completes that code path, right? Like if the form is valid, the user hits. So what have we done right now? We went to the URL for the form, and we kind of went through the code path of like how a form is rendered when it's empty. We tried to submit that form when it was valid, and we went through the code path of like when it was valid, all the way down to the form backend. So what will be what will be fun to do now is to submit an invalid form and see the kind of code path that takes, right? So we are here. An invalid form would be if I don't choose anything here, just like send feedback, right? So this should kind of get me here, right? Not here. This should get me here, right? So because form is not valid, so it would not process it. It would return the form as it is, and then we can sort of look at interesting things that are happening inside the form object, right? So let's do this. There it is, right? So it's exactly in the right place. Now let's go and look at forms and see how this happens in forms, right? So one thing we could do is go back to forms. We can kind of put the cheeky debugger. It's always a cheeky debugger, right? It's never a debugger, right? Breakpoint, sorry. So it's always a cheeky breakpoint and never just a breakpoint. But I can put a cheeky breakpoint here. And then what this would do is when I submit invalid data next time in my form, we kind of go through this initializer, see what are the thing, what is happening here, right? So and then we'll talk about it, right? So let it play. It's there. Do this again, right? Do the naughty thing where like I'm submitting without um, it gets me here, right? So this is where I want to be. So what's happening here? Like this is the creation, like this is where the form object is being created, right? Like so this is like a lot of like stuff that got passed in. There is the name, it's the name of the form. Items is just like what's inside the form. Backends is this bit, and then um, success URL is obviously this bit. Method is like whether it's a post or a get, because the form behaves differently depending on whether it's a post or a get. There's a bunch of other things. The data, for example, is this, like what is the data that is coming through? And then it calls a method, right? This method is called bind. And this looks interesting. So let's see what it does. So if I go here and I put a breakpoint in there, um, it kind of goes and stops here, right? So this is in bind, right? So what's happening here is that, I mean, if there is some data, which in this case there is, right? Um, you kind of go through the form fields. Now, this is very important, right? Like we notice that in the form, there is something called items, which is all the things in a form, right? And those things can include actual fields, but also like things like heading and a smaller heading, right? Um, what's happening here? Like it's fields and form fields, right? Like this is not talking about all the things inside a form, but specifically things that you can fill with data. And then it's assigning those fields the value that is passed in um, into the data dictionary, and it's assigning those fields the value. So it makes sense to kind of for us to ask the question like, what is form fields? Like, what does it do, right? So let's look at that. So this is form fields, right? What it does is it does an is instance check, right? So for all the fields, for all the items in a form, if the thing is an instant of a field set, right? So field sets are like, like you use them in forms to kind of group fields together. So this is a nod to that pattern, but it's a bit advanced. So don't look at that. Look at this, right? If the thing is an instance of a field, that means it you could conceivably assign data to it. You yield it, right? So that allows you to kind of go through the um, only the fields in a form and miss out all the H1s and H2s, right? We don't care about them right now. We are assigning data. Now, what happens next is also super interesting, right? So if I look at like what fields do we have here, right? So if I go to debug console and say self.v fields, right? We have a single field in this form, and that is a radio field, right? Let's try and look at that. Like let's look at what inside the radio field, uh, like when we say field.value equals to whatever the user submitted, what does that do, right? So that would be interesting, and that kind of completes the puzzle for this whole journey, right? So we go to inputs, I think, and then I can look for radio. Here is a radio. Now this is a single radio, right? So we're looking for radios, in fact. So radios, come on. There it is, right? So this is the field that kind of is a group of defines a group of radios, right? And so what this field has, in fact, what this field doesn't have. because what's happening here is that this field kind of inherits from the abstract field class, right? So the code that we're looking for would be somewhere around here, right? So, and I'm going to put a debugger here again and see, like we'll see. So see this? So this is a property, this is a getter, right? So it returns whatever the value is, right? Like, and here is the setter, right? So the setter is like whenever I do something like field.value equals to this, it's this function that's called, right? And it does a bunch of things. And the first thing it does is that if the field is required and the value is like empty, you assign an error saying this field is required, right? And then you return the value, right? So this is at its at its sort of like at the most basic level, this is like the most basic kind of validation you can do. If a field is not optional, and somebody submits a form without filling that field, tell them that this field is required, right? This is the very the most basic kind of validation you can do, which you're seeing here. So if I put like a breakpoint in here, what does this do, right? So this would it should hit the breakpoint. There it goes. So we are now into the breakpoint that we just put in, which is like the setter for the value in the field class, right? Which the radio uses to assign a value to a radio, right? So, and this is saying that if self is required, it is, and the value is empty, it is, then it assigns the field an error, right? Now, how does that? So this is all fine. If I play this, how does this, the rest of like, how does this error kind of gets populated here? So the answer to that is fairly simple, right? So if I go back to class radios, you'd notice that this class, this component has a dunder ft method, right? So this is the thing that renders the field, right? And in this method, you can see that there would be something to do with errors. Let's find it. So field set and class radios. Yeah. So basically, it's kind of what's happening here is that it's hidden because it kind of renders individual radios. So it is hidden somewhere here. Component value check. Okay. Yeah, possibly not. So I'm looking at where it's assigning the error class um, to the thing ft. Ah, yeah. So this is again funny, right? Because it's calling super here. So what's happening is that we need to go back to the base class, right? And the base class in its base class would have an ft method, and in this ft method, here is the error class, right? So if there is self.error, like if your field has an error, then assign the error class, show the error, and what that means. Okay, so I think I've talked about this, like we follow the code path around. So here is how it's laid out, right? Um, we have implemented all of the inputs in gov.uk design system, and we have implemented them with a base class called field that takes care of a bunch of things, but rendering labels, rendering hints, rendering errors, setting field values, and validation, basic validation, right? Like the field is required if it's empty, that's a validation. So this is the base class that does all of that. And then all of the other inputs are essentially subclasses of this base class that maybe, for example, tweak how it's rendered, tweak how the validation works. So for example, an email input would why is it? Yeah, I know why this is happening, but the email input would override the setter function and do the email validation only, right? So that's the only thing it needs to do. Everything else is being taken care of by the base class, right? So if you want to write an email input, this is the only function you need to override, add what you need to add. Everything else works exactly the same way, right? So that's um, so imagine the thing where like there's a design system where you've implemented all the inputs that take care of how those inputs are rendered, how the errors are rendered, how the inputs are validated, and all of that thing. And then you have you have the forms class to kind of tie it all together, like form being a collection of things, some of them being inputs. And then when you pass in the post dictionary to a form, it kind of goes and assigns the values to each of the input, and the input does validation, assign errors, and all that. So form is the thing that ties together like all the inputs in a form, right? So that's form. Um, Fairly useful. Yeah, that's form. Um, and um, yeah, and you use like finally you use the form decorator to register um, functions as like form creators to the framework, right? So in this case, we are using this decorator here, like in order to register that the fact that this function is indeed returning a form, and that kind of does the sort of like the statement, like it does the first bit it does is like hooks up to the slash form slash feedback URL. The second thing it does is it kind of manages the state machine of a form, right? Like it's a get request, is it a post request? If it's a post request, is the form valid? It's not valid. Show the errors. If it's valid, call the process, um, form backend, whatever. So that's how it's put together, I think. And um, yeah, I'm not um, I'm not used to doing this without people asking questions. I've done this many times, but there's always like somebody sitting next to me and we're like, "Oh, what did you say there?" And so this is like very new for me because I'm kind of it's like I'm talking into the void here, and I'm not entirely sure if this was useful and did you get it, or like did I miss something big, and do you want me to put more breakpoints? I don't know, right? So this is the best I can do in kind of like trying to explain how pages and forms work. Um, okay, so what's the plan? In the next video, what I do is I talk to you more about probably the most exciting thing in fast-gov UK, and um, that thing is something called wizards, or something the rest of the internet calls wizards, but um, the sort of the language in the GDS design system, it calls it question pages. I'm sure you must have seen this everywhere in GovUK services. The bit where they kind of ask you one question per page and and kind of keep you on that page until you get like give them the valid answer. And then based on that answer, they might move you to page two or page three or like depends, right? And that is called the it's called question pages in GDS. The rest of the internet probably calls them wizards. I call it wizard because I come from the rest of the internet and not from GDS. And what we're going to do, like this would be really fun. What we're going to do is there's an example here which implements the equality survey, right? So the equality survey is really cool because it is like in the design system website, it's there, so you can see it. But it kind of covers some fairly interesting concepts in how wizards um, um, like it would help me answer a lot of questions about how wizards work in fast-gov UK, and I think that will be exciting. See you then.